Hello and welcome to my land unit comparison chart. This is supposed to compare the land units of all factions across all tech levels. And if you are a beginner and you want to pick your faction, then this could help you with making your choice. And if you are an experienced player and would just like to see a comparison to understand which stages of the game to prioritize on depending on the faction you play in, then this is going to be interesting for you. So as I said, this is going to be about land units only, so no interactions with air units, no naval units, no base building and game enders. This is just land units. And I should also mention that I'm going to be biased because I am an Aeon player myself, and I usually only know the other factions from playing against them. Like, I sometimes try to play with the other factions, but not too often. And since I usually play Aeon and I usually play against Cybran and not so much against UEF and Seraphim, which are like popular ladder choices and like not too popular in team games either, like especially Seraphim is rarely seen, I may present the information here in a distorted fashion. So be careful with the interpretation and check for yourself. But this is my personal experience and maybe it helps you. So let's explain the chart. First, the colors. The dark green basically means that the complete package of the units in the stage and of the faction are overall great. And the light green means that the complete package is all right, like it's fine, right? It's like competitive and good, but it's like not necessarily the best in the game. The yellow stuff means that yeah, the units are okay, right? They get the job done, but they aren't like extraordinary in any way. And red basically just means that yeah, the entire package in this stage of the game is going to be bad. So that's the color coding. The star denotes what I observe to be the best package of units in the game. You see that Seraphim doesn't have a star. That's because I'm like kind of uncertain about the T2 stage, but I'll explain that later. More importantly, I want you to see that I don't just distinguish between T1, T2, and T3 and experimental, or T4, but I include like T1 arty in the T2 stage, because most T2 units in this game are tanks and not damage dealers. So you're going to need some damage dealers in your unit composition, which means it's important to build T1 arty in the T2 stage. So just a heads up that you don't forget about this, right? Like, people who mix their T2 composition and have no T1 arty in the mix aren't going to use their T2 units at their full potential. So keep building T1 arty. And T3.5, that's a term that like basically describes the high mass T3 units, which would be the Brick and the Percival for UEF and Cybran. And like T3.5 is the stage in between T3 stage and the experimental stage pretty much. And support SUs also find their application there, although they are not as like readily available for all factions, since like there are differences in their performance and the quantum gateways. Like, you cannot always build it, right? Like, some games simply don't allow it. And having a land factory that can produce bricks and Percivals is usually going to be better than having like a strong support SU option. So yeah, that's about the T2 plus T1 arty and the T3.5 stage. And the rest of the chart should be pretty intuitive, but we are still going to go through each of the stages, and I'm going to explain why the package of units is considered, or like I consider it to be like strong, not as strong, or like simply bad, right? So we start with T1, and across Aeon, Cybern, and UEF, we do see some specialization. UEF is about hit points, Cybern is about speed, and Aeon is about range for the T1 tanks. And it just happens pretty much that range is the strongest option among the three. Like, the categories aren't equally good, and prioritizing on range allows you to like get super good kill-death ratios. Like, you would fight with Aurora and micro them against other tanks, and you won't lose any Auroras pretty much, but all enemy tanks will be dead simply because of the range advantage, right? That of course requires like some protection against air, and it requires scouts or like T1 radars, but that's usually not too difficult to achieve, right? And microing is also not too difficult to do. So Aeon tanks are simply the best in the game for the T1 stage. And they also hover, and they also have hover scouts. So on maps such as Whitefire, for example, where you have water in between you and your opponent, Aeon players can scout without going like early air, right? Since the scout floats, the land scout. So very good package. And Cybern, well, it just happens that speed seems to be overall more useful than HP. This can be different in some maps, like if the map has lots of choke points, or it's particularly easy to cover the entire map with radars and scouts, then the speed advantage of the Cybern player is going to be largely nullified, and then maybe the UEF player may have the advantage. But generally speaking, you won't always see the units coming in time, and the potential of the Cybern player to choose their battles and retreat whenever necessary, or outrun defensive units and get behind them to kill the engineers, for example, that are expanding, or economic structures even, that is quite useful. So speed is overall better than HP, which is why I would give Cybern units like at least a slight edge over UEF units overall. And if you have like a fair and square 1-versus-1 fight, well, Cybern unit is going to be dominating against Aurora, but if you have large groups of units, then Auroras won't lose pretty much any units, whereas the entire Cybern army is going to die due to the range advantage, right? But for raid purposes, Cybern is extremely good. So even though Aeon are the best T1 units in the game, land units, Cybern isn't extremely far behind. The way you use them is entirely different, but if you know how to use them, like focus on raiding and like kind of the intel warfare, which Cybern specializes in, then Mantis bots are going to be extremely good. And well, I suppose Seraphim, like, they don't have a specialization. They're basically a compromise between like the Cybern speed and the UEF HP. But in a 1-versus-1, the THAM, like the Seraphim tank, is usually going to lose against the UEF tank, and is also going to lose against the Mantis. Like, if you like micro pretty hard, like I suppose the Seraphim tank could win over the Cybern tank, but like the speed advantage that the Seraphim tank doesn't really have over other T1 units is more valuable than like this micro powered win pretty much. So the tank is overall just like not excellent, right? It's not entirely crappy either. It gets the job done. It's a 2-1 tank. Like, it's not a piece of garbage, but it's not special either. So pretty difficult situation for the Seraphim player, that they don't have like any specialization in which they excel. And they don't have a light assault bot either. Like the Seelen, the combat scout, is an okayish unit. Like, it can kill engineers in some circumstances. It has the cloak function that gives them constant vision, and it can block mass spots. But this is just like a small package of tricks, which is not entirely useful. So I guess a lab is overall better. Like, you also have the option of ghetto gunships if you have labs. So the Seelen is just not the best unit, right? But the hover RD is extremely useful, and not just because of the hover ability, but also because it's extremely strong, right? It has the same mass cost of the T1 tank, and usually T1 RD is 33% less expensive than a T1 tank in mass cost. But for Seraphim, the RD cost and the tank cost is the same. So the RD is more expensive than the others, but it's also like pretty good. And yeah, well, it's called Stui, but like people call it Phobo because it is basically like it has the like the name comes from Lobo, like it has the power of the UEF RD pretty much and the area damage. So yeah, the Lobo, like right, Lobo, but they call it like Phobo because it's like floating. Or maybe also because like it's considered a mix of the Fervor, the UEF RD, the Aeon RD, pardon, and the Lobo, the UEF RD. That's why like Phobo is kind of the colloquial term for the Seraphim RD, and it's an extremely good RD. Like it is fairly good against groups of units as well, not just against structures, and in situations where like you have your army consisting like largely of artillery and your SU against an enemy army and their SU, then your RD is usually going to make the difference. And with some strong SU play, you're in a very good position with this RT. So it kind of makes up for the bad tank and for the lack of the lab, but not entirely. And that's why I don't consider these to be like top choices for T1 stage. But the others are, right? So I guess let's move on to T2 stage. T2 stage is pretty tricky for actually all factions because the gameplay differs across all factions. For Aeon, the main T2 unit would be the shield, and that basically implies you go T2, you get like a couple of T2 engineers to build like your usual stuff. Like in a team game, it would be T2 power generator or multiple T2 power generators, and Team D, maybe few T2 PD in a certain like choke or expansion, but like the most important part is just like the power generator, right? And that also applies to 1v1. Like usually you don't need TMD and PD as much in 1v1 gameplay, but like you go T2 for the power generator mainly. And that enables you to like operate some shields. Like you may want to build 2 power generators and get like a support factory to T2 to spam some shields. And that's going to allow you to like basically extend your T1 stage, since your Aurora is going to stay viable in the T2 stage, since like the only disadvantage of the Aurora compared to other tanks is that it has lower HP and like the speed as well, but like the HP is the most significant. And the shields are going to like cover this disadvantage of the Aurora entirely, and then you can basically get a makeshift T2 unit pretty much out of the Aurora thanks to the shields. And the shields, like they provide a lot of HP and they are fairly cheap, both in like mass cost to build and in power cost to operate. So shields are very nice for Aeon players, and it's certainly their main T2 combat unit, the shields. And another way to like kind of bridge the bad T2 stage for Aeon is going to be the gun ACU. The Aeon gun ACU has higher range than other gun ACUs, and that's why, like, you know, overcharge is like your basic counter against most T2 units, and the Aeon gun ACU is particularly good at like doing overcharge. But the reason Aeon players resort to shields and gun ACU is that their T2 land is just overall pretty crappy. Like they have the Blaze, which is a fast, like I call it panic T2 unit, meaning like you're trying to skip the T2 stage. Like you go from T1 to T2 just to get like a few power generators and engineers, and then you quickly go to T3. That's like standard Aeon gameplay because you want to exploit the strong T3 stage. And like if your T2 skip somehow fails, and you like get attacked by lots of units in the T2 stage, then you may have to cancel your HQ upgrade that's going to T3 and build Blaze tanks instead. Or you may want to like at least pause the upgrade and assist a support factory that's going to T2 and producing Blaze tanks. And Blaze tanks have relatively low build time, they are fast moving, so their overall deployment time, even if the supply route is large, like the distance between the fight and your base is going to be high, like even then they are like available pretty quickly. but they can't usually compete against other T2 units. And even though some people say that they are a counter against long-range units, like the Gatling bot and the Hoplite, they technically aren't, because like same situation as in T1, speed is just less useful than range in this game. So the like advantage of the speed advantage of the Blaze tanks is not going to make up for the range advantage of the long-range bots in the T2 stage of other factions most of the time. So the Blaze is just a kind of bad unit which you only build in emergencies. And the Obsidian is basically the opposite of the Blaze. Like it's fairly high mass, it's like fairly strong, but and tanky as well. But the problem is that like it can be out-microed by all other T2 units, since its range is low and its speed is low, and the turn range is also low. The like tank turn rate is also low, so not much micro capabilities. It is quite vulnerable to overcharge unless you bring mobile shields. Bring mobile shields is an option, but like this combination is not going to be as good as fast T3. So usually Aeon players skip T2 and find some creative solutions in like Panic T2, Gun ACU, or shields to like bridge the T2 stage and get into the T3 stage without staying on T2 for too long. So quite bad package overall, right? Like at least compared to the T3. So maybe this would be yellow, but like I feel that since the T2 units themselves, like other than these situational, you know, makeshift T2 substitutes, since the T2 units are quite bad, this deserves to be red, in my opinion. And for Cybran, like Cybran can do T2 skip as well. Like their T3 is fairly good, so not using T2 as much is an option for them. Especially because like Cybran doesn't have any hover tanks, so on maps with Navy, or at least with water, they can't like win back the water once they lost it. That's not too bad, because like the T1 frigate for Cybran is the best in the game and it's fairly strong, but like no hover and no shields is quite like a drawback for Cybran. And well, Cybran tanks, you have the Rhino and the Wagner, and like the balance always changes. Like sometimes it's the Rhino that is the stronger one, sometimes it's the Wagner that's the stronger one, but like in the current balance, it's basically like a pretty fair trade-off between speed and health. And speed is overall more useful, like you can see this comparison, right? So like I would usually build the Wagner instead of the Rhino, especially if I have large open areas to cover and the Rhino is just not going to arrive in time. And if you accidentally run into an overcharge ACU, then you can like retreat them faster if you have the high speed. And the HP is not going to tank the overcharge, right? So speed overall more useful. I would recommend to build Wagners instead of Rhinos in the current balance. And they are not excellent tanks, but they are alright. And Cybran players also have the range option, like the range bot, the Hoplite. Combined with stealth, it's a very strong unit. But the applicability of these units is relatively limited in some maps. If you have maps that have like many choke points or they're just small overall, then the Gun ACU is going to be a good counter, and it also has good coverage on the map. And like especially Aeon Gun ACU, like there's pretty much no range difference between the Aeon Gun ACU and the Hoplite, so Hoplites are going to get overcharged. And the Aeon ACU even has like a special radar upgrade that counters the stealth on the deceivers. So Hoplite not very useful against Aeon, at least, unless you manage to like rush them so quickly that the opponent won't even have Gun ACU by that time. But like anyways, the overall package for Cybran, like it's certainly diverse, but having no hover and no shields and like no like low mass swarms or like super high quality units is kind of hurting, right? And beetles are a snipe weapon, not something you put in your basic army composition, so not going to talk about these. Overall mediocre T2 for Cybran. And this is the tricky part now, because it depends very much on how you use these units. I think that UEF has the best T2 in the game. There are probably many people who are going to debate this, because like, not everybody has the perspective of an Aeon player, and like, pillars are really nightmares, because basically by the time the Aeon player has lots of auroras, and the Aeon player is basically ready to attack in large scale, the UEF player already has tons of pillars. Pillars are low mass units, and they come in swarms. Like, since they are so cheap and like fast to build, and you can pretty much like skip T1 to a large extent as UEF player and get pillars everywhere, you have these groups, right? And like, the standard counter to T2 would be overcharge, like especially gun ACU overcharge. And I feel that against UEF tanks, this doesn't work so well, because you're not going to encounter, like, let's say 3 pillars. You'll encounter like 15 or something, right? These things are just everywhere, and they hunt in packs. They are scary as fuck. So you have these huge swarms of pillars, and they have great HP. Like, if you basically trade 1 mass for like a certain number of HP, then this ratio on the pillar is about as good as a deal of the T3 units, like across the board, right? So basically, the pillar is going to be like weaker in terms of like firepower, but it has like insanely high HP considering it's a T2 unit, and like a single overcharge or a single T2 PD is not going to do too much to like a swarm of pillars, because like, even if you kill a percentage of them, the rest is still going to be surviving and attacking you, right? And the situation is very different for Seraphim, because Seraphim has like high mass quality units. So the T2 chicken bot is like super expensive, but also fairly good. Like, it's especially tanky. Micro capabilities, I would say, are average, and like, damage is fine, but like, especially the health and like the complete package is like super good, right? But if you send like a couple of these chicken bots together into an overcharge ACU, or into a couple of like, let's say Aeon PDs or something, right? T2 PDs, then you're just going to lose them all, and there is nothing you can do about it, because it's just a few units, right? So again, like, since the build time is high, the mass cost is high, and you have a lot of mass concentrated in a small single unit, you're going to like lose way harder to overcharge and PD. So that's why essentially the main Seraphim T2 combat unit is going to be their T1 RT, their Phopal, right? The one we discussed here. If I play Seraphim, I usually mix 1 Ilshavo, like 1 chicken bot, with 5 T1 RTs. So the T1 RTs deal all the damage, and the like the T2 chicken bot is going to absorb any PD T1 tank ACU fire, right? And this composition like works out fairly well. But if you are relying on like a group of units that consists like more or less exclusively of Ilshavos and like no RT or like other T1 units or ACU with them, then they are super vulnerable to overcharge. And only if you have like a super high amount of them and you basically out macro your opponent because you have a better build, you have more map control or something, then such a push is going to work out. But for the typical like hazards of T2 units, which is getting overcharged or killed by T2 PD, I feel that like large swarms of many units are usually better than having a few high quality units. And that's why I personally say that the UEF is better. Like, they also have the Gatling bot. If they really want to like rush T2 against Aurora, for example, and like ruin the life of the Aeon player, they can do so. They have mobile shields, which aren't as good as Aeon shields, but they're still alright. So like the complete package of the UEF player is probably the best in the game. If you just look at the 1 versus 1 unit capabilities, then of course the Seraphim are going to be better. But in practice, you don't usually get many Ilshevos, like the critical amount you need to get a kill, without getting overcharged, right? So yeah, you really need a lot. If you're Ajax, like you can just build 50 chickens by the time somebody else has like maybe just finish their gun upgrade and something, and then it's going to be cool, right? But most of the time, this is tricky to use, and you need to rely on T1 RT a lot. So not as good as UEF, in my opinion. So let's go to the T3 stage. We just assume that our Aeon player has survived the crappy T2 stage and pulled off a Harp Rush. Has got some Harpies, and he's usually going to load them in a transport and drop them at the enemy like T2 power or expansions or like even main base to kill the build power, and this is going to hurt, right? A Harpy is basically like a ninja. You put them into a transport, like load them to the perfect position on the map, and they're just going to clean up everything there is in no time. And even if they run into a large group of units, they can like fall back, shoot over the range, and get away. So Harpies are probably the best T3 unit in the game, even compared to Bricks and Percivals, which are actually like T3.5 units. Harpies win whenever there isn't any T3 on the board or the amount of T3 is low. Like if I have, let's say, 3 Harpies and my opponent is starting to get bricks or something, right? Depending on how I use the Harpies, I can still win the game, even though the brick is like, if these are equal numbers, the brick would win, right? But if I micro bit and we are operating on small scale early in the game, then the Harpy is going to be the best overall, even beating T3.5. And it's fairly fast, not as fast as the Loyalist, but it's still fairly fast. The fire cycle is good, the HP is good. It's basically just a great unit. So you can kill all sorts of stuff with it. Large groups of T2 units, or like expansions, economic structures, engineers in the base, everything. And if you add T2 shields, you can even like take on the SU. Since the T2 shields will tank the overcharge, and the Harpies can like fall back until the like shield has refilled or the next shield is present, and deal damage to the AC. If it's a gun ACU, it's going to be quite problematic, but if the ACU is not upgraded, you can even like kite it to a certain extent and get the HP low. So very good unit, really. Aeon players also have sniper bots. Already made a video covering the Sprite Strikers. Go watch it if you're interested. Good unit against like ACUs on the T2 stage mainly, but in certain circumstances also good later in the game. And the Absolver is worth mentioning because it really destroys fire bases. And you know, it covers for the weaknesses of the Aeon T3 mobile arty, which is the low area of effect damage. So high area effect damage is useful if you want to get down the shield by force and then just hit as much as possible. But the Aeon T3 RT doesn't have this high area of effect damage, so it relies on the Absolver to shut down the shield completely, so the RT can be aimed at the most relevant targets. So, different approach, but like still super good against fire bases, even UEF fire bases, since the Absolver is going to outrange Ravagers. If you ground fire the Ravager maybe, and the Ravager is covered by the shield, right? And for Cybern, I already said that the Cybern player can also pull off a T2 skip, since like the Loyalist can do many things the Harpy can also do, especially in this early rushed or like T2 skipped T3 stage. It's just a great raid unit, and Loyalists don't really get obsolete in the late game, since they are still high speed, like basically a T3 lab you could say. And they have this EMP damage, right? And the EMP is going to allow them to take down ACUs, experimentals. They just need to get close, and then you can start like self-destructing them next to the target. The target will be permanently stunned, and it doesn't really matter how high HP or high damage that target is, as long as it can never move and never shoot, the Loyalists are going to take it down. And the Loyalists are very much like the Pillars, except like a T3 pillar, you could say, right? they are low mass cost and they come in swarms. So there's many of them. And that makes it a really good unit. And the Cybran RT is also the best T3 mobile RT in the game. They don't have a shield disruptor in the form of the Absolver, or for the UEF this would be the mobile missile launcher, which I'm not really talking about, because if you're a UEF player and you want to take down a firebase, your most natural reaction would be to build your own firebase and not rely on these shield breaking units. But for Aeon, this Absolver is like fairly good, and Cybran just don't have that. So Cybran rely on higher area of effect damage, and they build RT until the shield is down, and then they just shoot into the general direction of the enemy, and the area of effect damage is going to take care of the rest, and stuff is going to die, right? That's the Cybran approach, you could say. And yeah, well, Seraphim, in terms of RT, is a bit like Cybran, like also high area of effect damage. But Seraphim also have the option to add like precise sniper bots that even outrange Ravagers in the secondary mode. And they have the T3 mobile shields, which are also like quite good, right? You can protect experimentals, your commander, support ACUs, or eco structures, like all sorts of stuff with these T3 shields. And that makes them a good unit. But the main combat tank for Seraphim, which is the Athum, is just not as good as the other tanks. So like Mozart calls it slipper because it looks like a slipper and it's relatively useless. Like if you're in the house, why wear slippers, right? Like who does that? Slippers are just kind of obsolete. Just like Athums, they aren't that great. Some fanboys are probably going to argue that if you have shields and Athums, they can take down quite a lot of stuff, but they haven't got any excellent raid capabilities like the other factions, and they don't have the bulk of the T3.5 units, and they're still fairly expensive, so not a great unit overall, and that's why like Seraphim is mediocre. And UEF is just bad. Like T3 UEF is basically just the Percival, and the T3 mobile RT, which is subpar compared to other T3 mobile RT. Like it has a similarly low area of effect damage as the Aeon T3 RT, but the Aeon T3 RT doesn't need to deploy while shooting, so UEF has the deployment disadvantage. It can't dodge, you could say. And the MML is just not so great, I suppose. Like, I can't look inside the head of a UEF player, I guess. Like, the way hasn't taught me that yet. But if I am T3 as UEF, I would rather build Ravagers and rely on the range that outranges T2 PD to counter enemy fire bases. And if the enemy is like building tons of indirect fire weapons like RT and sniper bots, then I would build my own RT. But it's just not the best T3 RT there is. So you really just have the Titan, which is a crappy unit, the RT, which is a crappy unit, and the MML, which is a situational unit. So usually you should just like never think about T3 UEF units as a proper like choice in land gameplay. So if you get attacked by swarms of T1 and T2, you can build Titans to defend against it. If you have no other options, like the Percival takes so long to build, then you may want to do it. But the Titan is just a bad unit. It's fast, but it doesn't deal damage. It doesn't really have bulk. It's just bad, right? So it tickles, it doesn't kill. Don't build it. So T3, not a good stage of the game for UEF, but if they have the time to get a couple of Percivals out, they are safe. And in the T3.5 stage, UEF is really excelling, because the Percival is the best T3.5 unit. It's better than the Brick. It's also, like, the support ACUs are pretty good. If you have like a mix of like few Rambo support ACUs and Percivals, that can take down like a lot. And usually the stuff you once conquer, like the map control you get, you're going to keep it, because the support ACUs are going to be able to build SAMs and Ravagers on the go. And all direct fire experimentals can be killed by Percivals. Like the GC is sort of designed to counter them to a certain extent, but if you have critical mass of Percivals, then they're pretty good at taking down GCs as well. So Percival's, you just need many of them, and then you're good for the rest of the game, pretty much. So T3.5 stage, super good for UEF. The shield support SU can be used to defend like valuable targets such as your anti-nuke, T3 stationary RTR, all sorts of stuff. But it's also just a good add-on to your army. If you have like a couple of like Rambo support SUs at the front, and the shield goes down, and then you bring your shield support SU, cover it until the Rambo support SU shield refills. These units build stuff meanwhile, so like kind of good combination. Together with Percival's, they just like creep across the map, and you can be more or less sure that all the ground you once capture, you're going to keep for the rest of the game, because it's like very easy to bunker up the gained area, right? Cybran has a pretty good support SU, probably the best next to Seraphim, but no option of the dome shield, and they rely on regeneration. So Cybran support SUs really like it when they have water nearby, where they can like just go underwater until they regenerate it, which takes maybe like 30 to 60 seconds, and then their full HP is restored. They get out again, shoot until their HP is low again, retreat into the water. Maps like Canis, for example, is a super good map for Rambo support SUs. So anything with a small pond on them, great, right? And bricks, well, are not as good as the Percival, but they still have a T3.5 land unit, high mass land unit. So that's great for Cybran. Seraphim doesn't have a T3.5 unit, and trying to use like large amounts of sniper bots and Uthums together with shields against T3.5 groups usually fails. So you should rely on support SUs. And you can either use Rambo support SUs, which have the shield upgrade, the nano upgrade, and the OC upgrade, and they're fairly low range, but they have the bulk. Or you can use the advanced combatant preset, which has the OC and the nano and the gun range. And this is usually the preset you want to go for, because it's the best support SU. One of these things can kill a chicken in 1v1 without taking damage, pretty much, because you just dodge everything, and you have the range too. Like, get the OC in, get out of like the danger zone, you could say, from the chicken, and like get in again, right? Like hit and run tactics, fairly effective. And you're only spending power, whereas the enemy is spending like mass when he loses the chicken. So a super good unit, also against like groups of T3.5 units. Some micro, get the OC in, excellent stuff. And the TML is kind of a trick. Like sometimes you don't have stationary TML on the map. People don't build TMD next to their important structures because they don't expect anything. Like they think, I'm going to build TMD as soon as I see someone building TML, but not before that, which is reasonable, right? But the support SU can have onboard TML, and you can have multiple support SUs with onboard TML. They fire the missile at the same time, and they get in a commander kill of a commander that's like under a weak shield and no TMD around, or like only a few TMD around. And this is like a super nice trick, and in some games it can really win. So also a good preset, but for very different reasons, right? And well, Aeon doesn't really have anything in the T3.5 stage. So Aeon players will try to, reach the T4 stage by just using their shield and gun SU. And if they don't have that, well, they kind of have to like super hardcore rush their experimental. Because if there are tons of bricks and Percivals, or like support SUs, they need their beam experimental, their GC to kill that. And if the game takes so long and they don't manage to win during the like early T3 stage, then this is going to be a difficult stage for them. And if you are not an Aeon player but playing as an Aeon, then this is usually the stage you want to attack in. Like you want to attack in the T2 stage and in the T3.5 stage, because that's where Aeon doesn't really have any options. And the Aeon player is usually going to be forced to bring their SU to the front, or like some players are going to go ARAS and like try to rush the experimental. But a very difficult time for Aeon. And especially with the shield nerf now, this is no longer such a great option, because the shield upgrade is now only 8 KHP as opposed to 29 KHP before the patch. So it's going to be weak, and this is like going to be a stage where Aeon is very vulnerable. So try to exploit that in the land gameplay, that is, right? So yeah, we talked about these. So let's go on with the T4, the experimentals. The GC is fairly good. It counters T3 and T3.5. That's its main purpose. Like, it outranges these support ACUs, so it has to be a ton of support ACUs to get like the critical OC damage in before the GC like kills one of these. Like, usually you can say that unless there is a lot of these things, the GC is going to like tear them down. Same story with Percivals. If you have tons of Percivals, they can kill a GC, but if it's just a few, then the GC is not going to take much damage and maybe even get veterancy, since the suction arms on the GC are going to like kill some extra Percivals, not just the beam, right? And like same for the brick. The Percival is probably better than the brick against GCs, since the Percival has this high alpha damage. So if you have tons of Percivals, it's going to be like easier to get high alpha damage into the GC and like reduce its bulk with the first shot before the Percivals like start taking lots of damage, which is not possible with the brick. These things are also fairly slow, so they like, to avoid the suction arms, they need to like go around the GC pretty much, which takes forever. So like, usually not a good unit to use against GCs. GCs are designed to counter these, but if the GC has no support, which sometimes happens, and if the GC is fighting against a swarm of these, then the swarm can still take the GC down. But overall, the GC is a solid experimental. It's not as good as the Siren experimental, but it's better than the chicken for sure. Siren don't have a mid-mass experimental. They have a low-mass spider and a high-mass megalith. And this basically allows them to be like a threat in the early T4 stage and in the late T4 stage as well. Especially in the late T4 stage, they have the reclaimability of the megalith. Like, if you place an egg of the megalith on top of some experimental wreckage, the megalith is going to reclaim at an insanely high speed. Like, it's around maybe 1000 mass per second or something. Your storage will just instantly fill up and the wreckage will instantly disappear because the megalith has high build power, and whenever you place the egg of the megalith of any unit pretty much on a wreckage, then you're going to get all the mass in like no time. And that's like a super good option. It's like, the Harby's reclaim feature is usually extremely situational and perhaps not even worth mentioning, because getting engineers into the places you already conquered is not too difficult. The Harp has lower reclaim speed than a T1 engineer, so it's not used extremely often, but the reclaimability of the megalith is just insane. And whenever you have a megalith and it kills some experimental, you can pretty much instantly get all the mass of that experimental wreckage into your own eco and get maybe another megalith or whatever you want to build, right? So extremely good unit. The megalith can also fall back while shooting if you micro it properly. The spider can rotate its turret, so you can fall back and shoot. The GC can't do that, so they're overall more useful. And if you time them correctly, they are extremely good units. And the megalith is going to take down a GC. And a Monkey Lord can also take down a GC if it has Loyalist support. Loyalists are super strong against GCs. So Siren has the best T4 land in the game. UEF is a bit of a two-edged sword, because the Fat Boy is technically the best experiment in the game if you have lots of them. If you have like 4 or 5 Fat Boys and you're fighting any number of direct fire experimentals, the Fat Boys are usually going to win. And especially if you have shield preset support ACUs next to the Fat Boys that give extra HP to the Fat Boys, the Fat Boys aren't killable by land units at all. Like, they will just tank everything and outrange everything. So like very much like a T4 Aurora, you could say, in their combat behavior. But the problem is that a T4 Aurora is not as useful as a T1 Aurora, because like the game starts in the T1 stage and it doesn't hit the T4 stage very often. And if it hits the T4 stage and you have just one Fat Boy, that's not a game ender. Like one experimental can be a game ender, but one Fat Boy, usually not a game ender. The Fat Boy just lacks the qualities of a direct fire experimental to be useful in small numbers. So you can maybe break a firebase, but if you give the opponent time to build T2 RT, then it's not going to work out either. So it's a good unit for sure if the circumstances are right, but usually it's difficult to use, especially early in the T4 stage. If you let's say you have a Fat Boy and you're fighting against somebody with a spider, then like you need to pray that you have tons of Percivals to kill the spider before it arrives at the Fat Boy. And if you don't have that, then the Fat Boy is just going to die, and it's not going to deal much damage to the spider, for example, right? So kind of a two-edged sword, but can be the best unit in the game if you have lots. And the chicken is just bad. Again, a support ACU with overcharge and advanced combatant preset for Seraphim kills a chicken if you micro it. And the chicken user, like even if he micros the chicken and ground fires and stuff, doesn't really have any way of taking down a well-microed overcharge support ACU. A microed GC can take out a microed chicken, a microed Monkey Lord can take out a microed chicken, a Megalith can take out a chicken, a Fat Boy can usually also take out a chicken before it arrives. Well, not necessarily, like a chicken is more expensive than a spider, so a spider versus Fat Boy situation is going to happen earlier than a like spider versus chicken situation. The UF player who may have a Fat Boy by the time the Seraphim player has the chicken has a better time frame to operate the Fat Boy against the spider, against the chicken than against the spider. Like the spider, it doesn't come as a surprise because it will be scouted and stuff, but it will still arrive faster at the UF player's base than the chicken. So the chicken is just not as much as an early threat as the spider, but since it loses in a 1 versus 1 against every other experimental, it's just kind of bad. The weapon system on the chicken has a very weird fire cycle. It has like a constant DPS weapon with very low damage, a hard to dodge, a relatively, like I would say mediocre damage weapon, and an extremely easy to dodge high damage, high alpha weapon. And like the first weapon you can pretty much ignore because it doesn't deal enough damage to do too many things. The second weapon, you can not dodge it as easily, but it's still possible to dodge it. And if that's the only weapon that's hitting you, then everything that's getting hit by it is probably going to survive. Like especially if it's an ICU, a support ICU, some faster moving experimental, that's okay. Like you can just tank it. And the only difficult weapon you need to evade at all cost is the small ball that comes out of the head of the chicken. And that's so slow that you can usually dodge it, unless you will like mess up big time. But you can usually dodge it with everything, like even GCs, right? GCs are like the fastest unit, but they can still dodge this light orb. So it's just a bad unit, right? And the suction arms are better against T3 and T3.5 than this weapon of the chicken. So it's, you can't say it otherwise, it's the worst T4 unit in the game. And that's sad because Seraphim doesn't exactly dominate in the other stages for land units. So if you are a Seraphim player, instead of building a T4, you should usually like assist the T4 of an ally or build more support issues. Or like you don't build any land in the first place, right? You play air, or you build like a nuke or some type of like T3 RT or whatever game ender. Maybe teleport, support SU, but you shouldn't build T4. T4 is just not the best option. The chickens are also super bad in groups. when you have other land units around, or your allies do, then the Uthui, the death weapon of the chicken, is going to kill them, and you lose tons of HP in a very short time. So difficult to avoid for your own units. If you can like land the chicken in the enemy base and the Uthui unfolds, then it can be quite nice to watch sometimes, but like honestly there are more effective ways of taking down bases that involve less master nations. So yeah, very bad unit overall. And now you should have a good overview over all factions. Again, Aeon good during T1 and T3 stage. Cybran not really weak across any of the stages, but not exactly excellent either. The hate between Aeon and Cybran players is pretty explanatory, because even though Cybran units are technically good during the T1 stage, the Aeon units are better most of the time. So the best chance the Cybran player has at killing the Aeon player is during the T2 stage or with snipes. And that's not always possible. So these usually just don't like each other, right? It just happens that it is this way. UEF players, strong T2, very fast T2, like you enter the T2 stage quickly, you don't leave it very quickly, stay in it for a long time until you can afford Percivals. And yeah, very strong setup this way. If you can skip the the early T3 stage pretty much, and avoid to get killed by harps. But UEF players have a good chance with pillars to like stop any possible like T2 skip and force the Aeon player to fight a T2 battle he's going to lose. And for Seraphim, well, not the best in any category, I'd argue. If you are a good player and you are better than your opponent, then T2 is usually the stage where your skill can shine out the most, since your units are going to support what you're doing. But for all other stages, you pretty much have to be better than your enemy to win. I guess unless you have strong ACU play and build a lot of RD and go for like commander-centric cheese, then you don't like really need to outskill your opponent by a lot. But Seraphim is really kind of the hipster faction, and good Seraphim players would probably be even better players if they played other factions. I guess that's a way to put it. But Seraphim isn't like technically super bad. It just doesn't has certain advantages of other factions during like particular stages. I guess it's well-rounded and good for beginners, but like especially mediocre players like myself, I guess, aren't as good with Seraphim as with other factions, because of how the units work across the tech levels. So I hope this video helped, and if you didn't know which faction to pick, maybe you know now. And if you wanted some insight into open team map or ladder tactics, when which faction is strong for which reasons, then I hope this video provided you the answers. And have fun applying your knowledge.